Hi, I'm John Addison from the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. I'm going to show you some really interesting items of photography from our collection today. The first one I'm going to show you is one of these. Now, if you find one of these in your collection, you're very lucky. This is a daguerreotype. It's the earliest form of photography that exists, and it was done on a copper plate coated with silver iodide. These are quite high-class items. They're the equivalent of getting a portrait painted, but because it was a very new emerging form of photography, a lot of artists took this sort of thing up, and they're really unusual. You can see here that they're quite silvery, and depending on what angle you look at them you can see them either as a positive or a negative image. These were usually housed within a little case. This one is missing its cover, and they came in a range of sizes. This is a very important one. This is a larger daguerreotype. This is Bishop Nixon. You can see that they came in a velvet lined case, and you can see here the silvery effect of the daguerreotype. So they came in a range of sizes, and they're very, very vulnerable to light, so we keep these covered and not exposed to light at all times, except for the very rare times that they go on display. Right, daguerreotypes were invented in 1839. They were fairly short-lived because other forms of photographs became available, and they stayed in use until around 1860. So that gives you a rough date range if you happen to find one of these in your own collection. What I have here is a collection of the next sort of photography that I'll tell you about. This is ambrotypes. They're similar in look to daguerreotypes, but slightly later in date. They began to be produced from about 1851. And they're a colloidal negative put on a dark background to make them positive. And they're also always housed within these little cases. And here's an example. These are really nice ones because this one you can see has also been tinted. So they stayed in use until about 1880, so they've got a pretty broad date range, so you're far more likely to find one of these in your collection. They're also very sensitive to light. Here's a family group. They come in a range of sizes as well, usually on the small end, but you do get some large ones. Here's another very nice one. These are slightly easier to view than daguerreotypes because you don't have to hold them on a particular angle. Sometimes you'll find one of these that's been taken out of its mount, and it will appear much more transparent because it's lacking its backing materials. The backing materials are often either paper or lacquer or velvet. This one I think is paper. And if you find one of these, don't confuse it with a daguerreotype or any other form of photograph. It's still an ambrotype, it just doesn't have that characteristic look because it's lacking its backing material. These range in date from about 1851 through to around 1880, so they have a much broader date range. So within the date range on these, you can actually see roughly what sort of date they are by looking at the costume. This one I would say is around the 1860 mark, looking at the gentleman in question. If we're looking at this one, this would be 1870s. The process was not quite as expensive as daguerreotypes. It was developed slightly later. So this is the very beginnings of photography starting to become something that was not just an elite thing. However, if you find one of these, it does tell you that the person that was having this done did have money. So from 1853, there was another development in photography, which is the development of the tintype, otherwise known as the ferrotype. Now this is interesting. It's a very similar process to the ambrotype, except that it was a print on a piece of lacquered iron. And they came in a variety of sizes, but generally they're small. You sometimes find them even larger, but what you're more likely to find in your collection is one of these small ones. Here's a larger example. So you can see here that it is, you can see the lacquered iron there on the back. And that's the type of look you get on the photograph. This is what you find in a very normal situation. These little tiny little, almost like thumbnail prints. And how they were used is that you found these displayed in this sort of a fashion within albums. Yeah. These are very prone to scratching and bending because they're actually on metal, and you can see some signs of delamination around the corners. But these mark a change into a far more democratic form of photography making. They were cheaper to make than the previous two processes I've talked about, so more people could afford to have them done. You'll notice here that there's a studio background here. Pretty much all photography at this period was done within studios, because that was where the control conditions existed to allow the long exposures that you needed for this type of photography. And often the poses are very formal, and you can often track certain repeated elements within these because they were always at a particular photographer's studio. If you see a photograph that has a background that looks a bit like a tent, that probably means that it's a photograph by a travelling photographer who is travelling around with a portable darkroom and tent. And this is where people would come out, get dressed up in their Sunday best and go and get photographed within that. So tintypes remained in use right up to about 1930. So once you've got, if you find one of these, you're going to then have a look at the costume and the props and what's in it to work out what date the photograph is. This is an albumen print. Basically, albumen is egg white, and it was used as the medium for producing these. They were developed in around 1850 and continued in use until about 1900, in parallel with a whole lot of other processes. So this one, you can see it's got a characteristic. This is when people think of sepia photographs. This is one of the processes that will produce that kind of a tone, but the tones vary depending on what sort of chemicals the photographer used. But this is really the beginning of the full democratisation of photography. This is where we start seeing more people being able to afford to use photography as a way of documenting their families and their activities. This one is an unusual one. This is from Beaconsfield, and the photographer hasn't got their own special stamp. They've actually written their name on the photograph here. And you can see here a young lady and an older lady, and what you tend to find is the fashions within these older people tend to be slightly 10 years or so behind the times in fashion generally, just as a matter of course. This one probably dates to around the mid-1860s, and you'll usually find these, not always but very often, mounted on a cardboard backing like this. Right, this is a silver gelatin print. This is a very large one. I'll open up the mount and you can see here the size and the thinness of the paper. Now this one is, you can see here, if I tilt it around a bit, you can see some of the silvering around the edges there. That's a telltale mark of the silver gelatin process. This one is by the Hobart photographer John Watt Beattie, and what's unusual about this is that it's outside. Now, he was one of the pioneers of this kind of outside work. Most photographers at the time were not doing this. So, but there's a chance that you might start finding some of this kind of material. Silver gelatin prints are more properly known as printing out paper prints, and they existed from about 1800 to the present. It's still a process that gets used for black and white. It's on paper or a resin-coated paper, and you'll see the tones are often black, grey, white, cream, beige. They can be glossy or matte depending on the paper that was used. And this is really the dominant process that you start getting from about the 1800s on right through to today. I've included another unusual type of photograph here that you may or may not find in a collection. This is an apallotype. It's a print on opalized glass. So you can see here this colour, this sort of matte colour of the glass. If you have a look at the back, you can see this one's got a coating on it, but just down here you can see the colour of the opalized glass. Apallotypes date from around 1882 and used through to about 1900. What's interesting about this one is you can see a process that's quite common in a lot of these kind of photographs. This has been tinted and, well, this has actually been painted on. It's a painted portrait. So The base of this, the main part of it, is a photographic print, but you can see here the lines of the tie, the moustache, the eyebrows, the hair, the eyes and the ears, as well as all the details in the jacket, have been filled in by the photographer using paint. So it leads to a very well defined and quite elegant image. So if you happen to find one of these framed, if it feels slightly heavier than you think it should be, it may be an apellotype like this one. So from around 1942 you start getting what we now recognise as a colour photograph. These are chromogenic prints. This is a particularly good one actually. You'll notice that, this is a colour photograph with 3 separate colour layers, cyan, magenta and yellow, and the dye molecules are synthesised when the print is processed. It's often on resin coated paper, giving you that shiny look. But these are often very susceptible to deterioration, and they will, so you'll often see that one of the colour layers has deteriorated quite a bit, leading to a sort of almost a tinted colour on that one. This one has not deteriorated particularly much at all. This one dates to 1969 and is a photograph of Jack and Eileen Brannigan. This is part of the Brannigan collection.